Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing remarkably well. I'm doing great, thank you very much, and all the better joining you this evening for a lovely story. I just love a good story. Nothing beats a fantastic story. I'm sorry, but it just doesn't, and I'm sure you agree with me. So before we get started, don't forget to go and get yourself that quintessential perfect drink. If it's something unusual, do let me know about it, because some of you drink the most phenomenal, unusual drinks. So before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, Emily Carmichael painstakingly packs her summer clothes in her rather scuffed brown suitcase, covered in hundreds of old stickers that she had used on numerous trips around Europe. She folds her clothes up rather neatly, checking that she's got everything she needs on her list. Finally feeling satisfied that her packing has been suitably accomplished, she sits on the suitcase with all her weight, pressing it down tightly shut and closing the rather tricky clasps. She draws in a deep, rather relieved breath. How much she had yearned for this moment, but as the years rapidly flew past like sands through the hourglass, she never thought it was ever going to happen. It was like an elusive dream, caught up in the stars, way beyond reach. But now the sparkle of her fragrant sweet hope had become a renewed reality, and not just a chimerical fantasy. Growing up knowing she had two male cousins, round about her own age, living in the Americas from her father's side of the family, had been a hard pill to have to swallow, as Emily had so longed to meet them. She had been raised an only child. Her mother had begged the universe for a second baby after Emily had been born. A little sister or brother perhaps for her daughter. But it was not to be. She was seized with regret when she had continuously miscarried, as her body simply refused to carry a baby to term. So her mother just speculated that having more than one child was not written in the stars for her. She was fatalistic like that, calmly accepting her lot with a resigned acquiescence. Emily had enjoyed a very happy childhood, and of course there were distinct perks to being an only child, like getting your parents' undivided attention, being blessed with generous, extravagant gifts. But she would have loved a brother or sister to play with. Emily knew full well that her two male cousins of a similar age to her, living in America, knowing that they were around, had lifted her heart exponentially. They would be the brothers she'd always wanted, and she could not wait to one day become acquainted with them. It seemed incredulous that, being half American, Emily knew nothing about the country from where her father originated, or her interesting American roots. She knew he'd been raised on a ranch and had ridden horses almost every day of his life. These days her father had a 9-to-5 job in the city of London, working for an illustrious law firm. He enjoyed his job, but Emily could not fathom how he could settle for a parochial, mundane, mediocre desk in a pedestrian office, rather than riding on the back of an American black-quarter horse in the countryside, with a dew-laden wind blowing against your hair and the warm sunshine dappling your face. Let's just say she'd asked her father on numerous occasions if he missed his old life in America, as to which he had curtly responded that looking back to the past was counterproductive, as the future was what needed your focus. Emily found her buttoned-up father's vacillating disinclination and wavering hesitancy to talk about his childhood more than a tad annoying. I mean, it was normal for a young inquiring daughter to ask questions, was it not? To find out about her father's life as a boy. But in every regard he had become like a laconic closed book, bound so tightly, with its pages stuck together with superglue, that you could never prise them open to read between the muted lines. Her father was stiffly unyielding in every regard. Emily knew as much about her father's young life in America as a car salesman might know about fixing a gas leak. Suffice to say, money had never been the issue. Her family could easily afford to buy tickets to go to America and book into a grandiose hotel for a month or two. But whenever they'd gone on overseas trips, they'd never ever visited America, which Emily perceived was more than a little peculiar. Why on earth did her father always avoid going back to the land of his birth? It made no sense at all. does Dad never talk about his old life in Colorado? She'd ask her mother. I don't understand why he's so tight-lipped all the time. I know nothing about the American side of our family, and Dad doesn't tell me a single thing. It's so annoying. He completely shuts down when I ask any questions, or he just barks at me. Well, you know your father. He's a very private person, dear. He likes to keep his past to himself, doesn't he? He's not forthcoming about his life as a young boy. There's not a lot you can do about that. But I keep telling you, it's crazy. It's nonsensical. Why all this secrecy? It's insane. I mean, don't I at the very least deserve to know about my father's side of the family? I'm half American, you know, and I know nothing about my roots. Everybody knows where they come from. But I'm just clueless. Darling, your father's reluctance to talk is his choice. As I keep telling you, there's not much we can do about it. Then one day out of the blue, her father's brother brought a plane ticket for Emily, which said, "We'd love to get to know our English cousin better, so please accept the plane ticket and come and stay with us for a month." Emily hadn't hesitated to accept the kind, fortuitous invitation, much to her father's great annoyance. Now she was going to America to stay in the very same farmhouse her father had grown up in as a young boy. Would many clandestine secrets that had been buried for so long resurface after years of lying dormant? Emily certainly hoped so. "Is it really necessary for you, sweetheart, to go to America?" her father had asked her gingerly. "Yes, Dad, it is. I'm glad my uncle has had the decency to send me a ticket because you've never given me one. I want to get to know your side of the family better, meet my cousins, stay in their farmhouse where you grew up as a boy. I might learn a thing or two, something about the life that you have been so evasive about." "There's no need to be like that, Emily," her father had responded tightly, his jaw flinching. Emily had overheard her dad's cursory comments to her mother. "Why is Theo interfering in our lives? Surely he's got the message by now. I never want to speak to the man ever again. So why is he getting in touch after all these years? He never wanted to speak to me back then at my mother's funeral, only spat poison at me. But now he's all buddy-buddy. I want nothing more to do with him. I wish he would leave us alone. Why all this interest in our daughter all of a sudden?" "I imagine his children want to get to know their cousin. That's perfectly natural. Clearly something went wrong in your relationship with your family all those years ago. Isn't it time you talk about it? Deal with whatever it is. Heal the old wounds. Let go of past indifferences and forgive each other. If you ask me, that's what you need to do. I wish you'd talk about what went on then." "It's none of your business, Joyce. Would you keep your nose out of my affairs?" her father had barked. Emily wondered what her father was hiding. One thing she knew with certainty. Her father had escaped to England to get away from his family, of whom he was desirous to sever all connections. It was so crazy. I mean, who does that? What could possibly have happened that went so badly wrong? It was like her father was hiding away from his past, had severed all communications with his American family. By all accounts, they seemed like genuinely nice people, so nothing made any sense to her at all. At the time of the trip, Emily was 21, and her father had not returned to his home country for 23 years. After acquiring a law degree at Oxford University, it would seem his American accent had almost faded away. But Emily sneakily suspected that her father wanted to remove all traces of his American roots, like a chameleon shedding its skin and blending in with its new environment, as if it had always belonged there. Very few people noticed her father was actually American, although sometimes there might be a distinctive twang in his voice that people might pick up, or words he used that would get people's attention, like yard for garden, sneakers for trainers, trolley for shopping cart, cookies for biscuits, sweater for jersey. It was so weird. In Emily's experience, Americans were so patriotic. So why had her father so eagerly abandoned his roots? Emily appreciated that she was half American. She was distinctly proud of that heritage. But why? Why was her father so lacking in that same loyalty that you'd naturally expect a man to have towards his country? Emily was hoping She'd soon learn all about his old life. She'd be moving into that farmhouse where he was raised as a boy in the Colorado countryside, and she'd not rest until she found out about why her father had fallen out so badly with his family. "You're not overweight, are you, darling?" her mother asks her. Have you weighed your suitcase yet? You don't want to be charged extra." "I'm not taking too much, Mum," says Emily, "so I doubt I'm going to have any problems on that score. I'm only going for a month, and it's summer, so how many clothes am I actually going to need?" "I know your father's not pleased about your going on this trip, sweetheart, but I think it's great you're going. Maybe you can fill me in about your father's secret life when you get back. Your father's never told me anything about his past. All I've concluded is that he had a massive fallout with his father and brother, especially at his mother's funeral. I do not know what the hell that is all about. So I hope while you're there, you can do a little bit of sleuthing for me, like Nancy Drew or Hercule Poirot, perhaps. Doesn't it bother you, Mum, that Dad is so tight-lipped about his past? I'd never marry a man if he refused to tell me about his early life. I'd feel he was clandestinely hiding something very significant from me, and I'd want to know exactly what it was. I don't believe couples should have secrets from each other." "Of course it's always bothered me," her mother confesses, fixing the loose strands of hair that have escaped her ponytail back into its golden clasp. "I think I very naively assumed after I married your father that one day he'd be forthcoming and unambiguous, ready to talk, tell me all about his young life and what had actually happened. But have you noticed your father's been like a bear with a sore head in the last few days? He's grievously upset about your going to America to stay with your uncle. There's no love lost between him and his brother. God only knows what went on there. I'd love to get to the bottom of this idiosyncratic mystery, but I'm not sure your cousins will be able to enlighten you about it. They're probably as much in the dark as you are. It might be best to have words with your uncle about it, when you have a quiet moment with him, when you become better acquainted with him." She pauses for a moment. "That is, of course, if he seems willing to talk. I've never met the man, but he has extended an olive branch towards you by inviting you over to America, so that's a promising start, is it not? It might be his way of saying to your father, 'Let's just move on. Let bygones be bygones. Put the past behind us.' Your father is mulishly stubborn, though, so I'm not exactly sure he's going to reciprocate any gestures of friendship in that regard. But we can only live in hope." It had been sad for Emma saying goodbye to her parents at Heathrow Airport. They were a close family. She had noticed her father had looked rather discomposed, like a flapping, disorientated pigeon that had lost its ability to fly. He had told her over 100 times that she could change her mind about going to America. Emily was doggedly stout-hearted and pertinaciously determined to meet her father's side of the family, and they seemed equally as keen to meet her. She couldn't wait to meet her cousins. Emily's parents watched her in a subdued, reluctant silence as she went through the airport gates, wheeling her hand baggage behind her. Emily's mother had been crying, almost as if she was moving away from Britain for good, which was ridiculous. "I'm going to miss you, sweetheart. Have a good time, darling." "Mum, don't cry, for goodness sake. I'm coming back, you know. You're not going to get rid of me that easily." "I know, sweetheart, but you're going to be gone for an entire month." "Mum, we can talk to each other on Skype whenever you want. It'll be like you're in the next room from me. And before you know it, I'll be back home." "Have a very good time, sweetheart," says her father, echoing his wife's sentiments. But his voice had sounded very flat. Emily thought he looked beleaguered as he kept rubbing his moustache awkwardly, which he always did when he was fraught with tension. It couldn't be helped, she had thought stubbornly. I have a right to meet my cousins. Her parents had soon given her a huge hug, and her father's hug had lingered for longer, almost as if he was unwilling to let her go. It was almost certainly true. He didn't want his daughter to visit his hometown, or where he'd grown up as a boy. "I better go now. Love you lots and lots," she said. "Have a good trip," her parents called out after her. She waved to them enthusiastically, hurrying towards passport control, where she'd keep herself busy, looking at the duty-free shopping to pass the time. The flight had been far from pleasant. Emily found herself sitting in between one very hefty woman,
with an expansive waistline, who was so huge that her voluptuous proportions had taken up most of her seat. Emily felt sorry for her, as her reticent but bashful brown eyes looked apologetic. On the other seat was a man with such big, long legs that he looked like a daddy long-legged spider. Emily was uncomfortably tightly squeezed between the both of them, like a thin Frankfurter sausage stuck between a very sizable fluffy bun. It would be a tight squeeze for most of the trip, and every time she had needed to go to the ladies, the man with the long legs had to perform some athletic manoeuvres to bounce out of his seat. So to avoid the obvious interruptions, she had tried to cut back on drinking too much, to cut down any unnecessary bathroom trips. Finally, in the middle of the flight, good fortune had smiled down upon Emily most favourably, as an air hostess, on seeing what an uncomfortable position she was in, found her an aisle seat somewhere further down the plane, and both the overweight woman and the leggy man seemed to sigh with relief when the thin Frankfurter, stuck between the two of them, had finally been extracted. "I could see you were uncomfortable there. I think tall and overweight people should possibly book 2 seats. It would make them feel a lot more comfortable," says the air hostess, giving her a warm smile. "Those seats are too cramped at the best of times, and they don't make allowances for body shapes, I'm afraid." "Thank you so much," says Emily. "I really appreciate your kindness." "Not at all," says the air hostess. "It's my job to make everybody as comfortable as I can." Emily had finally managed to get some much-needed sleep on a much more agreeable seat, where she sat next to someone of a relatively normal size. She'd never been more grateful about that. The flight to Denver from Heathrow Airport was under 10 hours, and the plane made excellent timing. She noticed the man who'd been sitting opposite her on the flight, who'd been twitching nervously the whole way, had been hauled over for an interview by the customs officers on arrival, and was wearing a decidedly bashful expression on his face. Emily noted during the trip the man had looked decidedly shifty. She had refused to allow herself to entertain the idea that he might be intending to hold up the plane. She wondered if he was smuggling something into the country. When she exited baggage control, she manoeuvred her suitcase towards a man with a placard with her name on it. He looked every inch the Colorado cowboy, but far too young to be her uncle, and too old to be one of her cousins. "Howdy. You're Emily Carmichael, Theo Carmichael's niece, am I right?" She nodded to the man. He had a charming American drawl, was wearing a black cowboy hat, Levi jeans, a nifty leather belt with a huge bronze buckle, and a blue and black plaid shirt that was rolled up at the sleeves. Emily would guess he was in his 30s, with a golden complexion that looked like he spent the days outdoors, his skin hungrily lapping up the sun on the back of his horse. Emily knew at once he was the quintessential Colorado cowboy. She'd seen enough country and western movies to know the look. Did he work on the ranch with her uncle, she wondered. He gave Emily the hugest smile, with such white teeth that made Emily suddenly very self-conscious of her own, as no one she knew had teeth so white that they'd make the clouds look tarnished. She was aware that the whole of England should be queuing up for American dentistry to acquire that perfect Hollywood smile. "Howdy," he said again. "Sorry, my name is Russell Crowe. I'm very pleased to meet you." Emily raises a cynical brow. "You're not Russell Crowe. For goodness sake," she giggles. "Come on, you're winding me up. Is that some kind of weird joke? Because if it is, I'm not actually laughing. I know what Russell Crowe looks like. I've seen him in movies, and you don't look like him at all. Actually, you're much better looking than he is." The cowboy lets out a chuckle. He raises an amused brow, smiling at Emily through his inquiring blue eyes. "Well, you are quite the charmer, aren't you? I am Russell Crowe, you must know. Is it so impossible for 2 people to have exactly the same name? Why do you find that so surprising, so hard to believe?" "Well, it's not exactly a common name, is it? So your name then really is Russell Crowe, and you're not winding me up?" "I'm not winding you up. It's on my birth certificate. But nobody I know actually calls me Russell. Everybody calls me Crowe, from since I was knee-high to a grasshopper, and the name just stuck. I think it's because I've always been very inquisitive, and crows, well, they have a reputation for being highly observant." "So everybody calls you Crowe, then? Oh my word, it's rather cool. I kind of like it. It's cute, actually, although some might describe crows as annoying birds, but personally, I rather like them.
Oh, I can be that too, says Crow. I can be exceedingly annoying when I want to be. He picks up her suitcases and directs her to the Land Rover Discovery, where he gently places her suitcases in the trunk of the car with a breezy efficiency. And then, like a true gentleman, he opens the passenger side door for her. And then Emily climbs in. Before long, they're driving in light traffic, moving away from Denver. So tell me then, how was your flight? I'm not keen on flying myself. I hate those cramped seats on aircraft. Can't stand them, actually. I don't like being seated for too long. It gives me cramps. I like to be out and about, not stuck up indoors.
That's a good way to put it, says Emily. It was cramped. The less said about that, the better. I'm so heartily relieved to be off that plane. I assume you work on my uncle's ranch. You look like a cowboy.
Crow chuckles. You think I look like a cowboy?
100%. I've seen country and westerns, a plethora of them, you know. You look like one of those ruggedly handsome, strong, athletic cowboys. You're just missing one thing.
And what's that then?
The holster and gun, of course. You need to hold up the bad boys that are drinking in the bar, don't you?
Well, I do have a holster and gun at home, but not with me now. I manage the ranch with your uncle. He's a very good man, you know. When he told me to pick you up at the airport, I nearly did another take. I couldn't believe it. I had no idea the boss had an English niece, or an American brother for that matter, who happens to be living in England.
So has he never mentioned me to you? Asked Emily, looking disappointed.
It's not that he hasn't mentioned you to me, says Crow kindly. You know, when you're running a ranch, you talk about current things, as that's your prime focus. We definitely live in the moment. You could say our concern is the welfare of the steers, vets' visits, the food they eat, stuff like that. It all reflects on the quality of the grass-fed meat we produce, and that is what concerns us the most.
But it doesn't bother you that you're raising the steers for meat? I mean, don't you get attached to them at all? I know if it were me, I would. I love animals, you see.
It's funny you should say that. There is one steer we have on the ranch that's been there for years. Your uncle loves the bones off that steer. Never been able to part with him. He's quite the character. His name is Mercy, and let me tell you, that steer thinks he's a dog. We gave him the name Mercy because he's never been turned into beef. I've never seen such an affectionate steer before. He's very attached to your uncle. Of course the steers grow on you. It's human nature. You get attached to them. But we make sure we give them a very good life. I always tell myself that they might never have been here if we weren't raising them for beef, and that puts everything into perspective.
I never thought of it like that, but you make a very good point. You give them a good life that they might never have enjoyed if they hadn't been born. And if it wasn't for the production of beef, they wouldn't even exist. So it's a little like a bit of living as opposed to never existing in the first place. And then that's a no-brainer as far as I'm concerned.
Exactly. So tell me, why have you not been to America before? Because you are half American. I understand it's your first visit here, and you're 21 years old.
I wish I knew the answer to that question, says Emily, raising a brow. My father was raised on the ranch, and yet he never ever talks about it. We know nothing about his life here in Colorado when he was a boy. If we ask him any questions, it's like talking to a brick wall. He refuses to tell us a thing. He'll get all cranky and belligerent and say, I don't want to talk about it now, that sort of thing.
Crow gives Emma an inquiring glance. That is odd. What do you think's going on there? Why all the secrecy?
I have no idea. I think there was a major fallout between my dad and my uncle and his father. My father refuses to talk about it. I think it happened at a funeral, his mother's funeral. I'm hoping I'm going to get some answers from my uncle.
Crow chuckles. You want answers from your uncle, do you? Well, good luck with that, young lady. Your uncle is a cowboy through and through, but I think he communicates with the steers and the horses more than he talks to any of us. That's the way he is, but he's a good man, heart of gold he has. Would give you the shirt off his own back.
but he's never been a good talker at the very best of times. Reserved, I think they call it. Mind you, that remarkable wife of his can open him up. She seems to know exactly what buttons to press, which is more than can be said for the rest of us, I'm afraid.
Emily feels the disappointment rising up in her heart. If her uncle would not talk to her about her father's life in Colorado when he was a boy, then she'd never get to the bottom of this mystery that had haunted most of her young life. Never mind, she had arrived in America. She was determined to enjoy the trip, come what may. At the very least, she'd become well acquainted with her cousins Harry, who was 22, and Joseph, 24. Would they be able to shed light on this enigmatic mystery for her? Emily very much doubted that they knew any more than she did. The drive took about 4 hours from Denver. They passed through Fairplay, Salvia, and Poncho Springs, and mountain passes like Kenosha and Red Hill Pass. The ranch was situated not too far from the Colorado mining town of Crested Butte, where they used to have a thriving coal and silver industry, until it had sadly started to decline. It is situated in a remote location in the East River Valley, and is often referred to as the wildflower capital of Colorado, as all year round the scenery is bursting with vibrant colour, and the Crested Butte Mountain Resort is a primary winter attraction, much like resorts like Vail and Aspen, offering steep skiing opportunities to visitors. Emily marvelled at the views of the arresting countryside from her passenger side window that quite literally took her breath away. The sanguine, lofty mountains were magnificently imposing as they imperiously subjugated the landscape, spiralling up audaciously into the sky, with sculptural contours and rugged, voluptuous twists that would be an artist's dream to recreate on canvas. The meadows were bursting with perennial alpine flowers that implacably shoved themselves eagerly through the grass, determined to splash their vibrant colours like paints in abstract art, being thrown against an oiled canvas of rich yellows and greens. If this wasn't enough eye candy for you, the scenery was magnanimously wrapped up in the prepossessing packaging of a cobalt blue sky, where the white cotton candy clouds that floated above them were like swans navigating a graceful course over a blue sea. "It's so beautiful," gasped Emily. "So incredibly beautiful. I can't believe my father grew up in a place like this. There's so much space. Open meadows, fields. It's so very big. I can't get over the size of everything."
"It's big all right," laughs Crow with a bright smile. "I think especially for you folks from England, it can be daunting to be around so much space. But I promise you, you're going to like it here. It's difficult not to fall in love with Colorado."
"You think I'm going to like it here?" says Emily. "That's an understatement. I don't think I'm going to want to leave this place. I think my father's family might have difficulty in getting rid of me. I might literally tie myself to a tree with chains and simply refuse to leave. They do that in England, you know, when people don't want trees cut down."
Crow laughed. "No need to tie yourself to the Carmichaels' house with a chain. The Carmichaels would love you to stay for as long as you like. You could move in for good and they'd be over the moon. I will say this about Colorado to you. She does have a sneaky little way of getting under your skin, you know, but in a very good way."
Suffice to say, Crow was such good company, the landscape so transfixing, that Emily did not know where the time had got to. Before long she heard Crow saying, "Not long now. We are nearly there." She was almost disappointed. The ride had been so scenic, and Crow's company had been convivial and humorous. She almost didn't want it to end. She could feel her heart flip-flopping with trepidatious anticipation. She was getting disquieted about meeting her father's family, as the nervous reticence suddenly overcame her. Crow laughed, sensing how restlessly fretful she had suddenly become.
"Goodness gracious me! I can hear your heart beating from here," he teased. "You're nervous about meeting the Carmichaels, aren't you? Let me tell you something. They're the most down-to-earth people you could ever meet. You'll be made to feel right at home at once."
Before long, the Land Rover Discovery was cruising down some dirt roads strewn with rocks, and the hard-wearing tyres of the Land Rover Discovery brazenly picked up columns of white smoke.
"Brace yourself for impact," laughed Crow. "You're in for one hell of a bumpy ride from this point on, I'm afraid."
I thought Land Rovers were made for these kind of rough roads.
Well, this road is the exception to that rule. It's not your run-of-the-mill road. It's an obstacle course.
Soon they reached a cattle gate, and Crow jumped out of the driver's side door and hurriedly opened the gate.
We are finally here, you'll be glad to know, he says. This is your uncle's ranch.
There was a signpost next to the gate that read Loversteer Ranch, which Emily thought was quite catchy as a name. The Land Rover Discovery meandered smoothly down the long dirt road that was even wider than the road they'd recently travelled down and a lot less bumpy. It was surrounded by sprawling pasture, framed by the statuesque imposing silhouettes of the mountains in the far distance. In one field they could see a plethora of brown and black steers, all gathered together in a large group, while a cowboy on the back of his horse was riding behind them. When he heard the truck, he glanced briefly over his shoulders, waving furiously at the Land Rover Discovery, lifting off his cowboy hat from his head.
That there is your uncle, laughed Crow. He's waving at you, definitely not me. He knows I brought you back from the airport. I hasten to say your aunt is going to be very excited to see you. She's a very enthusiastic woman, you know, like a great big ebullient dog at the best of times. She'll be jumping all over you. That's a promise. She's worse than their Labradors.
Before long, Crow passed a large red barn, a scattering of outbuildings, a smart-looking stable block, and finally the Land Rover Discovery drew to a halt. He fastidiously parked the truck next to 4 other off-road vehicles, all covered in fine dust, underneath the large canopy of an open carport. There were about 3 quad bikes there, along with a scattering of mountain bikes parked haphazardly against the far wall. The stone and wood ranch-style home smiled at her welcomingly, but before Emily could drink it all in, a woman in her early 50s wearing her hair swept away from her face in a hazelnut ponytail, along with a pair of jeans and cowboy boots, came dashing towards the truck like an unbridled, enthusiastic puppy dog, followed by 2 slightly reticent-looking young men wearing cowboy hats that followed behind her, their faces dappled with shy smiles. The unreserved, gushing woman, who was clearly her Aunt Ruth, eagerly opened the passenger side door, with the enthusiasm of a kid trying to get into a box of candies. Emily stumbled awkwardly out of the truck, and seconds later found herself being swaddled in her aunt's effusive, fulsome arms. The woman hugged her so tightly that Emily could barely draw breath. She'd never received such a vociferous welcome in all her life, and the prodigal embrace threw her off guard and made her face break out into a large smile. It seemed that her aunt was an outgoing, loquacious woman who wore her heart on her sleeve and was openly affectionate. Her aunt let out this thrilled, squealing sound, "Ah! Ah!" and began jumping up and down as if she was skipping with a rope. "It's wonderful to see you, Emily. So wonderful. I'm so excited you've come to America. This is just so fabulous," she says obsequiously. "These are your cousins, Emily. The handsome skyscraper over there, well, he's my oldest son, Joseph. He's tall, dark and handsome, as you can see, just like his father. And the short, squat one here, well, he's Harry."
"Thanks a lot, Mother, for the very flattering introduction you've given me," says Harry, giving Emily a cheeky grin and a friendly wink. "Don't listen to a word she says. She's overlooked how incredibly handsome I am. She must be as blind as a bat."
Both young men extend their hands out towards Emily to shake hers, but their mother slaps them away furiously. "Honestly, what are you boys like?" she says, scolding her sons. "This is your cousin Emily. Doesn't she deserve a hug, a big welcome? We don't stand on formal ceremony here." The 2 young men blush appropriately, their skins taking on a pronounced pink hue. In a demure obedience to their mother's every command, they both give their cousin an effusive hug. "Let's have a look at you," says Ruth, stepping back to observe her niece more closely. "I can see the family resemblance. Yes, I can. You've got the Carmichael blue eyes and the very distinctive long face and definitely the Carmichael hair. Oh, the Carmichael hair. I could write books about it." Emma did notice that both of her cousins bore a striking resemblance to her. She could easily be considered to be their sister, as the likeness they shared was uncanny, and even rather bewildered her cousins. They both had thick dark hair, the colour of a raven's feathers, that you could never straighten, even if you lathered onto it 2 bottles of straightening gel. as it always intractably chose to do its own thing. But the black curls that rolled over her cousins' faces like the tumultuous ocean waves looked exceedingly attractive on both of them. Joseph was the taller of the two, but Emily would not have described Harry as short and squat, or thick-set or chunky as her mother had described him. He was shorter and well-built, while her older cousin was streamlined and slender. They both had olive skin acquired from living the quintessential outdoor lifestyle, and both boys were eager to follow in their father's footsteps and become ranchers. Emily could never imagine them caught up in a routine 9-to-5 job like her father. It was hard for her to imagine her dad slitting into this kind of lifestyle, as he seemed so far removed from the natural world. It would seem her cousin's family harmoniously belonged here, like the steers grazing in the field, the horses frolicking in the meadows, the 2 family Labrador dogs bounding around the house like bullets, both whom had given Emily a heartfelt welcome when they'd returned from the fields with her uncle, whom they clearly were exceedingly bonded with. Emily's uncle had been very timorous when he entered the farmhouse kitchen at lunchtime, but he extended her the warmest grin that Emily had ever received, and Emily responded in kind, giving her uncle a warm hug, which seemed to please him immensely.
"I'm very glad to meet you, Emma," he said. "How is your father doing these days? He's well, I hope."
"He's doing great," she had said, studying her uncle studiously to see how he responded when she talked about her father. But his unflinching face gave nothing away. "He works in London for a legal team. He's a lawyer, you know, doing high-profile cases. I can't imagine him living this kind of lifestyle under this very same roof."
"You'll be sleeping in your father's room. He had as a boy," says her uncle. "Believe it or not, back in his day, your father was quite the cowboy. He was a natural on horseback, I'll have you know."
At this, Emma looks bewildered. "He's a natural cowboy? Are you joking? I'd never have believed that in a month of Sundays. I can't even envisage it." She clears her throat, as all eyes around the table look up at her in surprise. Emily quickly butters her cornbread, as everyone is studying her face curiously, and she suddenly feels very conspicuous. "So your father never talked about his life here in Colorado, then?" asks his Aunt Ruth. No, he didn't. I'm not sure why, but his past is like a closed book to us." Emily quickly notices her aunt and uncle, giving each other knowing looks. She realizes that her aunt must know what happened between the 2 brothers. Emily surreptitiously decides that she's going to work on her easygoing aunt, get her to tell her the truth about what happened to the 2 men all those years ago, and why they haven't talked to each other for so long. So there we are. That's the end of part 1. Part 2 is tomorrow night. Until next time, goodbye and good night.